There was a time when people practically gave these engines away, forgotten and unwanted. You could find them sitting behind barns, under dusty tarps, buried inside old pickup trucks that hadn't moved in years. Some owners couldn't sell them. Others scrapped them without a second thought. At the time, nobody imagined they were getting rid of something future enthusiasts would desperately want. And looking back now, a lot of those owners probably wish they had kept them, because hidden inside those forgotten engine bays was an engine people completely misjudged. An engine that spent decades overlooked before finally getting the respect it deserved. The engine nobody wanted. Today, enthusiasts search for them at swap meets, auctions, estate sales, classic car gatherings. Not because they're rare, not because they're exotic, but because people finally discovered something they had been overlooking for decades. And once that realization spread, the reputation of this engine began to change. To understand why, we need to go back to one of the most competitive periods in American automotive history. Back in the early 1960s, Ford was fighting for horsepower supremacy. Every manufacturer wanted bigger numbers, more speed, more performance, more attention. And right in the middle of that battle, Ford developed one of the most important engine families it ever produced, the FE series. Introduced in 1958, the FE family would eventually include the famous 427, the legendary 428 Cobra Jet, and one engine that spent most of its life in their shadow, the 390. Most enthusiasts remember the stars, the engines that dominated magazine covers, the engines that won races, the engines that built legendary reputations. But while those engines grabbed headlines, another FE engine was quietly earning its place in garages and driveways all across America. The 390, the workhorse of the family. Unlike its more famous brothers, the 390 wasn't designed to become a legend. It was designed to work. And that's exactly what it did. Ford installed it in countless vehicles throughout the 1960s and well into the 1970s. It powered family sedans, pickup trucks, large cruisers, daily drivers. It wasn't built for trophies. It was built for real-world dependability. And millions of Americans trusted it every single day. The 390 delivered strong torque, reliable performance, and the kind of durability owners appreciated long after the showroom excitement faded. But there was one problem. The 390 spent its entire life standing next to giants. Whenever enthusiasts talked about FE engines, the conversation almost always shifted to the 427 or the 428 Cobra Jet, the engines people dreamed about owning. Meanwhile, the 390 kept doing the heavy lifting while the spotlight stayed elsewhere. And over time, that created a reputation. People started viewing the 390 as the ordinary FE, the engine you settled for when the exciting option wasn't available, the engine that rarely got anyone's attention. But that reputation was hiding an important truth, one that most enthusiasts completely missed. Because while everyone was busy chasing horsepower numbers, they overlooked something that would eventually make the 390 valuable again. Something hiding in plain sight the entire time. The secret everyone missed. And once collectors finally understood what they were looking at, the forgotten workhorse suddenly wasn't forgotten anymore. The funny thing is, the people who respected the 390 the most were never the magazine writers. They weren't professional racers. And they certainly weren't the guys bragging about 427s at car shows. They were the people who actually depended on these engines. The engine that earned its reputation. Farmers, contractors, truck owners, working Americans who needed their vehicles to start every morning and get the job done. Because while the performance crowd was chasing horsepower and quarter-mile times, the 390 was quietly building a reputation that would outlast them all, not for speed, for durability. The 390 arrived in 1961 and quickly became one of Ford's most widely used FE engines. And ironically, that success became its biggest problem. It was everywhere, in cars, in trucks, in driveways across America. And when something becomes common enough, people stop appreciating it. But the people who owned them never forgot what these engines could do. They hauled heavy loads, pulled trailers, crossed state lines, worked through scorching summers and freezing winters. Many survived years of hard use. Some survived years of neglect. Yet somehow, they kept running, again and again. That doesn't mean they were flawless. No engine is. But the 390 earned something far more valuable than horsepower bragging rights. It earned trust, and that trust would become incredibly important later. Because while enthusiasts were busy celebrating Ford's headline makers, the 390 was quietly building an army of loyal owners, built for the real world. Think about it. A race engine only has to impress people. A street engine has to survive people. School runs, work commutes, family road trips, missed maintenance, endless starts and stops, year after year, and the 390 handled that reality remarkably well. Yet despite all of that, most enthusiasts still looked right past it. Their attention stayed focused on the glamorous FE engines, the 427, the Cobra Jet, the race winners, the magazine covers, the legends. Meanwhile, the 390 kept doing the heavy lifting with almost no recognition. And every year that passed, the gap between its reputation and its actual value grew wider. People began treating the 390 like the engine you settled for, the one you bought when you couldn't get the engine you really wanted. That assumption would follow the 390 for decades, and it turned out to be one of the biggest misunderstandings in Ford history. The big misunderstanding. By the late 1970s, the automotive world was changing. The muscle car era was fading. Fuel prices were rising. Insurance costs were climbing. And suddenly, yesterday's big block cars weren't attracting much attention. Many were parked and forgotten. Others sat behind garages for years. Some were stripped for parts. Some were scrapped entirely. And with them, thousands of 390 engines slowly disappeared. At the time, almost nobody cared. Why would they? The 390 wasn't the famous FE. It wasn't the rare FE. And it certainly wasn't the engine collectors were chasing. Or at least, that was the common belief. The reality was something very different. And every year that passed made that mistake more expensive. Years of neglect. Throughout the 1980s and much of the 1990s, enthusiasts chased newer performance combinations. Small blocks became the hot ticket. Engine swaps became the trend. Original drivetrains were pulled out of countless classic Fords. Some 390s were replaced. Others were sold for almost nothing. Many simply disappeared. And with every engine that vanished, the remaining survivors became a little more important. Not enough for people to notice at first, but enough to change the future. Because while the supply kept shrinking, demand was quietly waiting around the corner. Most people never saw it coming. Then something unexpected happened. A new generation of Ford enthusiasts started looking back. They dug through old records, old magazines, old stories, and they started asking questions. Why did Ford build so many 390s? Why did truck owners trust them so much? Why did so many old-timers refuse to criticize them? And one question stood above all the others. What if everyone had been wrong about this engine? The reputation begins to change. Once enthusiasts started looking deeper, the picture changed fast. People realized the 390 wasn't surviving simply because Ford built a lot of them. It was surviving because owners kept finding reasons not to get rid of them. The engine had powered everything from family sedans to work trucks, from Galaxies and Fairlanes to Thunderbirds and Mustangs. It had been part of countless American lives, and that mattered. Because collectors don't buy specifications, they buy stories. Some remembered learning to drive behind one. Others remembered family vacations. Others remembered a father's truck that seemed impossible to kill. Suddenly, the 390 became more than an engine. It became a piece of personal history, a connection to a different era, a different America. And as those memories resurfaced, the market began to notice. Prices didn't explode overnight, but they started moving. Enough for experienced collectors to pay attention. Enough for enthusiasts to start searching again. Enough to make former owners repeat the same sentence over and over. I wish I still had mine. And those words became more common every year because people were finally discovering something that should have been obvious all along. The 390 was never supposed to be a race engine. It was never supposed to be a 427. And that was exactly the point. What happened next would completely change how enthusiasts viewed the engine. Because they were about to realize they had spent decades comparing the 390 to the wrong benchmark. They had been comparing it to the wrong engine all along. For decades, enthusiasts were asking the wrong question. They kept asking, why would I want a 390 when I could have a 427? And that single question shaped the engine's reputation for years. Because the moment that comparison started, the 390 had already lost. The wrong comparison. Think about it. Comparing a 390 to a 427 is like comparing a dependable workhorse to a thoroughbred racehorse. One was built to dominate headlines. The other was built to survive real life. Different missions, different owners, different expectations. Yet enthusiasts spent decades judging 390 by standards it was never designed to meet. And once people finally stopped doing that, the entire story changed. Suddenly, enthusiasts started seeing what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The 390 wasn't special because it was the fastest FE. It was special because it wasn't trying to be. That realization opened a lot of eyes, especially among builders who were becoming tired of chasing horsepower numbers alone, because they were rediscovering something older generations already knew. An engine can be remembered for far more than peak horsepower. More than horsepower. Horsepower sells magazine covers. Torque creates memories. And the 390 had plenty of it. A big Ford powered by a 390 wasn't built to scream at sky-high RPM. It wasn't built to spend its life at a drag strip. It was built to move, confidently, effortlessly. Owners remembered the feeling, the deep rumble, the instant pull, the way the car seemed to glide down the road without ever feeling strained. Even in a heavy sedan, even in a truck, even with passengers and luggage on board. Numbers on paper couldn't fully explain that experience. You had to drive one. And as younger enthusiasts finally got the chance, many of them understood exactly what older owners had been talking about for years. A new generation looks back. By the early 2000s, something interesting was happening. Restoration culture was growing rapidly, but people weren't just restoring vehicles. They were restoring pieces of their own history. Old Mustangs, Galaxies, Thunderbirds, F-Series trucks. Cars and trucks that had once been overlooked were suddenly getting a second chance. And many of them originally came equipped with a 390. At first, owners searched for these engines because they wanted authenticity, factory-correct restorations, original drivetrains, period-correct builds. But then something unexpected happened. They started driving them, really driving them. And the more miles they put on them, the more appreciation they gained. The same qualities that made the 390 valuable in the 1960s still matter decades later. Strong torque, dependability, mechanical simplicity, real-world usability. The engine hadn't changed. People's perspective had. They finally understood. For years, enthusiasts saw the 390 as the engine that wasn't a 427. Now they were seeing it as the engine that was a 390. And that changed everything, because they stopped focusing on what it lacked and started appreciating what it offered. That shift sounds small, but it transformed the market. Collectors noticed, restorers noticed, builders noticed. And once enough people start paying attention, demand starts growing. That's when another reality became impossible to ignore. The engines themselves were becoming harder to find. The engines were disappearing. Remember all those engines that got pulled out decades earlier? The ones sold for next to nothing. The ones abandoned behind garages. The ones scrapped because nobody thought they mattered. Most of them were gone. And they weren't coming back. Every year, more restorers entered the hobby. Every year, more collectors wanted authentic builds. Every year, more enthusiasts started searching for original FE engines. But the supply kept getting smaller. Not because Ford built fewer of them, but because time had quietly been eliminating them for decades. And suddenly, the abundance that once hurt the 390's reputation was gone. The engine that used to be everywhere wasn't everywhere anymore. Regret begins to set in. That's when the stories started appearing. Stories heard at swap meets, car shows, auctions, garage conversations. I had one of those. I sold mine years ago. I wish I kept that truck. I wish I'd never gotten rid of that engine. The same people who once viewed the 390 as ordinary were now discovering something uncomfortable. Replacing one wasn't nearly as easy as it used to be. And that's when regret entered the story. Every enthusiast has regrets. The car they sold too soon, the project they abandoned, the parts they threw away. For a surprising number of Ford enthusiasts, the 390 became one of those regrets. Because what once seemed ordinary was becoming increasingly difficult to replace. The engine people want back. But this comeback wasn't just about money, or collectability, or rising prices. It went deeper than that. The 390 represented something many enthusiasts felt was slowly disappearing. A time when engines were mechanical, straightforward, accessible, honest. A time when you could lift the hood and understand exactly what you were looking at. No screens, no complicated electronics, just metal, fuel, air, and engineering. For many enthusiasts, owning a 390 wasn't simply about owning an engine. It was about reconnecting with a different era, an era they remembered fondly. Road trips, family vacations, weekend projects with their fathers, summer nights behind the wheel. Memories attach themselves to these engines. And memories are powerful, sometimes far more powerful than horsepower numbers. A quick message for MotorVault viewers. If you're enjoying stories about forgotten American engines, hidden automotive history, and the machines that shaped generations of drivers, make sure you're subscribed to MotorVault. Because some of the most fascinating automotive stories aren't about the engines everyone remembers. They're about the ones everyone underestimated. And this story is far from over. Because the most surprising part wasn't that enthusiasts rediscovered the 390. It was what happened after they did. That's when competition started increasing. That's when good examples became harder to find. That's when prices began climbing. And that's when people realized the forgotten workhorse wasn't forgotten anymore. The comeback was real. The market had finally made its decision. Collectors wanted them. Builders wanted them. Restorers wanted them. And former owners wanted them back. After decades of living in the shadow of bigger legends, the 390 had built a reputation entirely on its own. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the rarest, but because it had earned something many engines never do: respect. Yet the biggest surprise in the entire story still remained, because the reason enthusiasts value the 390 today has very little to do with specifications and everything to do with what the engine ultimately came to represent: the legacy nobody saw coming. The truth is, most collector engines become valuable because they're rare. The 390 became valuable for a much harder reason. People changed their minds. The legacy wasn't built in a factory. Think about the engines that become legends overnight. The race winners, the limited production monsters, the headline grabbers. Their reputations are built quickly. The 390 took the opposite path. It spent decades proving itself, decades earning trust, decades doing jobs that rarely made magazine covers. That's why its story is different. The 390 wasn't carried by hype, it was carried by experience. One owner at a time, one family at a time, one generation at a time. While other engines built fame, the 390 built relationships, and in the long run, that turned out to be even more powerful. The owners never forgot. Talk to enough Ford enthusiasts and you'll notice something interesting. Very few start with horsepower numbers. Instead, they start with stories. The truck their grandfather drove, the family station wagon that never seemed to quit, the Galaxy that crossed half the country, the project car that sat in the garage for years before finally returning to the road. At some point, the engine stops being a collection of parts. It becomes part of a memory. And that's when something changes, because people rarely miss an engine's specifications. They miss the moments attached to it, the sound when it fired up, the vibration through the steering wheel, the feeling of heading down the highway on a summer evening. The 390 became part of countless memories like that. And memories have a way of becoming more valuable with time. More than an engine. By now, enthusiasts were realizing something the market had overlooked for years. The 390 wasn't important because it was the fastest FE. It wasn't important because it was the rarest. It was important because it represented an entire era of American driving, an era that was slowly disappearing, a time when vehicles felt mechanical, direct, connected, a time before screens dominated dashboards, before software filtered every driving experience, before everything felt the same. The 390 came from a period when engines had distinct personalities. You could hear them, feel them, recognize them. And that's exactly what many enthusiasts were searching for. Not perfection, Not technology, not even speed, something far more emotional, character. The search intensifies. Once that realization took hold, the market started changing. Enthusiasts began searching for original FE-powered vehicles with new urgency. Old trucks, Thunderbirds, Fairlanes, Mustangs. Every surviving vehicle suddenly represented a shrinking piece of history. And every year, the search became harder. Many of the easy projects had already been restored. Many of the neglected engines had already been lost. Many of the forgotten bargains were gone forever. The conversation had completely changed. People were no longer asking whether the 390 was worth saving. They were asking where they could still find one. And that shift said everything. Because once enthusiasts start chasing something, the market usually follows. When the market finally notices, every collector market reaches a turning point, a moment when appreciation becomes competition. The 390 eventually reached that moment. More restorers entered the hobby. More collectors wanted authenticity. More enthusiasts wanted factory-correct builds. Demand kept climbing, supply kept shrinking, and the gap between the two became impossible to ignore. Values began moving higher. But here's what made the 390 different from many collector engines. A lot of buyers weren't motivated by investment potential. They weren't chasing auction records. They weren't hunting for quick profits. They were trying to recover something they once had, or something they wished they had never let go. And that's a powerful force, far more powerful than speculation. The regret factor. That's when the same stories started appearing everywhere. At car shows, at auctions, at swap meets, in garage conversations. I had one. I sold mine years ago. I wish I'd kept that truck. I wish I'd never gotten rid of that engine. Those words became increasingly common, and that's usually a sign that something has become truly valuable, not because of money, because of perspective. Regret happens when people finally recognize the value of something after it's gone. And for many Ford enthusiasts, that's exactly what happened with the 390. They didn't lose a collector engine. They lost a piece of their own history, the engine that outlasted the critics. What makes this story remarkable is how completely the conversation changed. For years, critics focused on what the 390 wasn't. It wasn't a 427. It wasn't a Cobra Jet. It wasn't a racing icon. But over time, enthusiasts stopped caring about those comparisons. Instead, they focused on what the engine actually was: reliable, durable, versatile, honest, a true working-class Ford engine. And once that happened, the criticism lost its power. Because the people who spent years owning these engines had already reached their conclusion. The critics moved on, the owners didn't. And in the end, owners usually write the final chapter. Why everyone wants one now. So why does everyone want this forgotten Ford engine today? Not because it's the rarest, not because it's the fastest, not because it's the most powerful. The answer is much simpler than that. The 390 represents something many enthusiasts feel is becoming increasingly rare: authenticity. A machine that spent decades proving itself instead of advertising itself. A machine that quietly earned respect while flashier engines collected the attention. A machine that survived long enough for people to finally understand its value. And maybe that's why its story resonates so deeply, because in many ways, the journey of the 390 mirrors the journey of the people who admire it, underestimated, overlooked, dismissed too early, then finally appreciated for what it truly was. The forgotten engine won, after all. And that's the irony. The engine that spent decades living in the shadow of Ford's biggest legends eventually became a legend itself, not through racing victories, not through magazine headlines, not through marketing, but through loyalty, durability, and generations of owners who refuse to forget it. That's why enthusiasts are still searching for them. That's why collectors are still restoring them. And that's why the engine nobody wanted has become an engine so many people want back. Because sometimes the greatest automotive legends aren't the ones that shine the brightest. They're the ones that quietly stand the test of time. And the Ford 390 did exactly that. If you enjoyed this story, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. Why did racing officials ban this 318 before it even started? Because that engine's story begins with a decision that shocked racers before the competition even began. And once you hear what happened, you'll never look at the Chrysler 318 the same way again. I'll see you in the next video.